Welcome. My name is Edith Garcia. I'm the Director of Communications here at NCECA, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 virtual conference, Rivers, Reflections, and Reinventions. Today's theme will be speaking around responsive practice. Responsive practice presentations will provide a platform to reflect, share, and consider new ways to integrate theories and methods to build resilience, adaptive, and inclusive practices and opportunities through the ceramic arts. I also have the immense pleasure of introducing the keynote speaker, Ronald Rael, Chair of Architecture at UC Berkeley's College of Environmental Design. He is an applied architectural researcher, a design activist, author, and thought leader in the fields of adaptive manufacturing and earthenware architecture. Ronald draws, builds, and writes 3D prints and teaches architecture and craft as a creative cultural endeavor, deeply influenced by his own personal upbringing in a desolate alpine valley in southern Colorado. He speculates on the implications of the Borderwall, building with mud, using 3D printers to create buildings. As you can see in his publications, Borderwall is architecture, earthenware architecture, and printing architecture. Rael is also the founding partner of Oakland-based Make Tank and Emerging Objects. Ronald, for me specifically, has significant impact in the way that he works. I myself personally grew up in El Paso, Texas, in Ciudad Juarez, which is a border town between the United States and Mexico. Seeing the impact that border walls have had on these specific regions. And Ronald has been able to cultivate and create projects that bring awareness around those issues. And he's been able to create a practice that both breaks down the barrier, brings awareness, and at the same time is helping the individuals that live within those communities to be able to move forward and pass the governmental issues of building walls, of building architecture that divides communities on both the American and in the Mexican side, and wanting to ensure that we bring those communities back together in a meaningful way. Welcome, Ronald Rael. Thank you.
The title of my lecture is Rasquachando. What does that word even mean? I'm using this word, a Spanish word of Nahuatl origin, as a verb. Rasquache is often a term used to describe anything lower class or impoverished. Sometimes it is used to describe the clever way that people do more with less, doing the best with what they have, with limited means. Sometimes the word is used pejoratively, like when one reuses plastic utensils or Ziploc bags, or turns a container that food came in from the store into something like a salt shaker or a plant pot. In Chicano and Mexican art movements, there's an appreciation of the inventiveness of Rasquache, of being an underdog, and the creativity and resourcefulness present within frugality and limited resources by pursuing the most basic, simplest, and crudest means necessary to create something special. The ideas how to do more with the least have been a lifelong practice for me. And I have taken this philosophy into my creative and even into my academic practice, thinking about how using the humblest of materials, like piles of mud or discarded materials we might find around us, or brightly painted sticks, can allow for the pursuit of ideas that are transformative and maybe change the world. I'm going to take you on a journey today through my studio, which I share with the designer and educator Virginia Sanfratello, who you'll meet in just a moment, and see how for us, limitations have been presented as opportunities as we think about how to live in a world where barriers placed before us might be overcome through design, through craft, through technology, and community. And first, we're going to go visit our lab at UC Berkeley.
We were interested in using 3D printing, and we couldn't afford the printers or the materials. And so we hacked the printer and developed our own materials using very inexpensive, very ubiquitous materials. One of our goals is to make this technology accessible to more people. We have a bit of an activist agenda about that, and that is something that underlies a lot of our work.
Most 3D printing is plastic, and while we've done a lot of experimentation with plastic, our main interests are to think about how we can use materials that are recycled or upcycled or sustainable. Voila, 3D printed curry.
One example of a project where we started to blend the ideas of 3D printed plastic with using clay is a project we did for the Bernadotte Gallery in Limoges, where we built upon the traditional architectural process of wattle and daub, and we 3D printed a wattle structure using bioplastic, and we used local clays from Limoges, France, to apply to the surface of the structure, giving it this incredible characteristic and architectural surface.
We were speculating on what the future of building with earth would be. We started trying to print clay, so that led us into 3D printed ceramics. Here in the print farm, we have an array of different kinds of 3D printers. We have printers that can extrude clay, and you can see a range of our experiments that we've created over the years. The thing that we get most excited is how the tool allows us to think about new possibilities for endangered species habitats and coral reef restoration.
Our studio embarked on 3D printing over 4,000 ceramic units for creating a seed pods where coral larvae can embed in. You can see we're 3D printing the loops, and coral can embed themselves into these structures on the ceramic. And we used various kinds of processes, extruded ceramics, but also binder jet 3D printed ceramics. And here we partnered with a ceramic company in Boston. Here we're depowdering those ceramic units before they go into the kiln. And there are various types so that the scientists could study the different ways that coral larvae could attach to the ceramic substrate, and different packing methods where they could be dumped from a boat, or scuba divers could go down and attach them directly to the surface of the ocean. And so this was a really fulfilling project because it's being now tested all over the world with a lot of success.
There's a housing crisis in the Bay Area. That prompted us to say, well, here is an opportunity to think not only about how 3D printing might be able to respond to that housing emergency, but also it opens up the possibility for us to test novel materials and techniques.
We'll design a block or a tile or component and think about how those blocks and tiles aggregate together to make larger occupiable structures. We are now at the cabin of 3D printed curiosities. These are local materials. These dark brown tiles are printed out of Chardonnay that comes from Sonoma. The lighter brown tiles are printed out of sawdust, which comes from the Sierra Nevadas. And sometimes we recycle all of our materials together and print tiles out of a mixture of materials as well.
Whereas the front's made out of recycled and upcycled materials, the sides and the roof are made out of locally harvested ceramic. The beautiful thing is that they are like the tree bark starting to take on moss and lichen. We like that part of architecture. We like the way natural materials behave over time. The house is very much, I would say, a California house. It is a kind of vernacular. It's a really nice example of the way we think about the future by looking at the past.
Ultimately, we won't see the ceramic objects that we made, and we won't really care that they were 3D printed. All of that will become invisible. And I think that's the definition of success.
I was in Juarez and El Paso when the regime leader said there are a lot of bad hombres at the border. And he didn't say there were bad hombres at the border, which are bad men. He said there are bad hombres at the border. And I thought, well, that's interesting to think about an hombre at the border, this gradient between two worlds. In the art world, of course, the idea of an ombre is this gradient between light and dark. In the hairstyle world, I think this is a bad ombre on the left, and maybe there's a good ombre on the right. And so we created a series of objects called bad hombres out of 3D printed ceramic, where we began to combine different clay bodies from what I would define as the democratic state of California and from the Republican state of Georgia, bringing them together to think about the distinctions and differences, yet the idea of this is one object and within that object held these kinds of distinctions at different scales, at the scale of the object itself, and zooming in at the scale of different details in the structure. We thought conceptually, wouldn't it be much more interesting if we made bad ombres using clay from Mexico and clay from the United States? And that opened up a possibility of thinking about how we can bring this technology to the contemporary border, thinking about how we can just go and dig up clay. And we worked on a project bringing together geology professors from the University of Texas, El Paso, a ceramic professor from the University of Texas, El Paso, and about 25 clay artists from Juarez and El Paso to travel, and students, of course, from UTEP, to find and think about the several thousand-year-old ceramic tradition of the borderlands in that region of the Mogollon people, and to excavate sites of clay and to use those in the fabrication of a series of 3D printed objects. And we found this amazing range of complexions of clays, from whites to reds to browns, even greens in some cases. I think I have some pictures of that. And we developed a very simple app that would allow the ceramic artists to create objects for the 3D printer. Because we went there to teach 3D modeling, for example, and the complexities of printing. And so this app we've now commercialized as an app called Potterware that is used all over the world for 3D printed clay. And it's something that runs in the cloud, so it can run on multiple computers, and just using a series of sliders can produce some really marvelous objects. And so while we expected the 25 potters to produce 1 or 2 objects over the course of the project, they were so excited. I think they in total produced 270 3D printed ceramic vessels using clay from the 2 countries, exhibited at the Rubin Center in El Paso, Texas. And it was a really amazing project for us, which we didn't make these objects. We released the authorship to them, empowering them by thinking about clays that could be used in a software that we allowed everyone to use that was really accessible. But part of the vision has always been to think about how we can print large-scale 3D printed structures using local soil, growing from the traditions that were the traditions of my own childhood. And so this is the vision, right? How can we 3D print with clay to make architecture? And so we're now in maybe year 3 or 4 of this project. The very first part of this project was a schematic design for a robot that I sent to a manufacturer in Florida and said, hey, do you think we could build something like this? And it was very excited to get the answer back, yeah, let's do it. And so that design turned into this 3D printer that we co-developed at 3D Potter, which was exciting because it could produce a number of 3D printed objects simultaneously, which I guess I didn't really think about, because this was the goal, to 3D print one very large object. But in scaling up, there were other problems, like how do you pump massive amounts of clay through a 3D printer? And so this is an example of a manual 3D printer here, but we're really testing how we can push huge amounts of clay through it. And as the project evolved, we got more and more precise and were able to finesse the project. And at a certain point, gained the confidence to then return to the borderlands in a project that we called Mud Frontiers. We also call it Soquetes Fronterizos, which mud is about mobility, ubiquity, and democracy, to think about how we can use the land itself, which is ubiquitous, in a way that we're creating our own robot, which is lightweight and inexpensive, a software which is very accessible and easy to use to create large-scale structures. And so this is the first test of 3D printing in the borderlands using a material technology that has been used here for thousands of years. And I'll just let you watch this while I take a drink of water. So we tested this by going out to a very remote environment, excavating clay from that environment, making these experimental structures, also digging clay with our friends from Taos Pueblo to make functional pottery, to explore ideas of possible structures under four themes. One was about lightness, and in this case, how thin or light you could create an adobe structure, which is typically incredibly massive, but by curving or corrugating the mud itself, just like the difference between a corrugated piece of metal and a flat piece of metal, you have tremendous strength. But thinking about how that light can be used in these remote environments as kind of beacons at night. The other experiment was called Lookout, where we were simply experimenting if we could 3D print a staircase and what that means. And it opened up other possibilities of thinking about how in a very cold environment like it is here, for example, you could have a massive wall, but a massive wall that is not filled with material, but filled largely with air, creating an insulative barrier from the interior to exterior. We also produced, in our very first structure, which was the ugliest one, it took us a really long time to figure out, we made a kiln in which we created a series of functional pottery in the tradition of picuris pottery, which uses micaceous clay, and micaceous clay allows for this to be used as cookware because the mica helps absorb the heat shock. And so this can be used to make beans, for example, and meats.
So all these structures are really studies. They're experiments to see what's possible, and we have a confidence now in producing these.
To embark upon a much more ambitious proposition to make a very large-scale, multi-room dwelling. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it now.
So welcome everyone to La Florida, Colorado. This is a village that my family's lived in for 7 generations, and this is behind me, Casa Cueva. It's a house for cohabitation that we built now during the time of COVID when we relocated here to my ancestral village to experiment with 3D printing and 3D printing using Adobe, which many of the houses here in this county are made out of. And so I thought that I would first give you a little tour before the sun goes down of Casa Cueva. And then I'll contextualize this work a little bit relative to the borders. So come on along. I'll show you my laptop stand really quickly. So just to give you a sense of the building, these are 3 different rooms, and I'll talk about the program, but over to the left, you'll see that we're experimenting with beginning to program these structures, and we've constructed many of them on this property. You might see some over there behind the truck a little bit. Those are some of our earlier experiments. There's one we call the hearth that's out in the field out there. And here we're beginning to think about how do we 3D print furniture? How can we 3D print program? How can we make spaces for gathering, and thinking about how this technology might be used not only to create prototypes and experiments, but maybe in the future reintroduce Adobe as a viable material in contemporary architecture and construction. So let's go inside. The first room inside is a space for gathering, and you can see that it is a space with seating, and so 2 people can sit and hang out and talk, and we have a fireplace where we can actually cook. Put a little bit of wood on the fire. What we burn here, we also use the same wood to make the pottery, is Western juniper, which grows locally, and it's beautiful because it's aromatic and smells really wonderful, but also has this amazing purple color. I don't know if you can see that so well on the camera. One thing about this space is that it has these amazing oculi up into the sky. And so while we were considering a roof for this building, we're also really taken by the fact that we can see the sky and the stars and the clouds moving overhead. This room here is a space for bathing, but it's also a place where you can see the sky while you're taking a bath. The exterior rocks are made out of tumbled river stone, and the interior rocks actually glow. And over here is the wonderful room for two people to sleep. It's a room that has space for two people, and the surface is made out of sheep lamb pelts. And if we zoom in a little bit, we're working with some friends, indigenous weavers, who are wove these beautiful textiles for us, these beautiful pillows. This one actually has the plan of Casa Cueva on it. So you see the hearth space, the bathing space, and the sleeping space. And that is this beautiful view out into the field through this window. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about this place that we're coming from right now and give you a little sense of what we're up to out here. So we're in a pretty special place in Colorado. It's at 8,000 feet above sea level, and it's where we are beginning to reconceptualize what the borderlands is, and kind of returning to ways of thinking about architecture that grows from this landscape. We are in the highest alpine valley in the world, called Valle de San Luis, or San Luis Valley. And it defines borders in many different ways. One is it's surrounded by 13,000 and 14,000 foot peaks, and it straddles the border between the states of Colorado and New Mexico. And until 1848, this was the northernmost frontier of what was then Mexico. And so the relationship that we have to the United States historically was similar to what you might think of the border cities today and their relationship to the United States along that border. It's also the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, which of course today defines the contemporary border between the United States and Mexico, but it was the river itself that fed and was the lifeblood of people who have lived here for thousands of years. The Pueblo, the Kiowa, the Ute, the Comanche, the Jicari Apache, and also a route for colonialization and settlement to the north. And so in this landscape, the memory and history of this being the borderland still continues. And these are some of the earliest kinds of structures that were built here when Colorado was settled, especially after the Mexican-American War, when it was New Mexico and then Colorado Territory before it became a state. And many of these buildings still exist. And we are actively working to preserve many of these buildings. I think we are currently working on 11 different adobe houses in the surrounding like 8 or 9 miles from where I'm standing right now, including my own house, our own house, which is just down the road. And this was my great-grandfather's sister's family's house, and it was one of these houses, just like you saw previously, a flat roof adobe house. My father put on this roof in the 60s, but we use this village and this ranch as a way to teach traditional construction methods, adobe construction, earth and plaster, but also traditional and indigenous foodways. And so the construction of hornos, the making of traditional and indigenous foods, has led to a project that's really interesting, building mud ovens along the US-Mexico border as a way to bring communities, migrant communities specifically, together around food and recipes and traditions.
And it's part of a little documentary film that I just want to share with you now.
Mi padre fue asesinado cuando yo tenía 8 o 9 años. Mi mamá se volvió a casar con el hombre que se casó, fue amenazado por los carteles. Sí. Tuvimos que huir de nuestra casa. Ahora que ya soy de edad, esperemos casarnos cuando tengamos un lugar seguro.
Todo eso ahí, abandonado, y tener que ir a otros lugares a empezar de cero.
He pasado por muchos países, he pasado por 5 fronteras.
Pues ahorita estamos esperando una solicitud de asilo para poder entrar a los Estados Unidos.
Tengo 8 años, ya tengo un año aquí.
Y todo por culpa de gente mala que en nuestro propio país tenemos.
Mi vida estuvo en peligro, está en peligro, hasta el día de hoy yo no puedo regresar a mi país.
Fue una trayectoria muy fea, muy fea, muy fea.
Cuando Lika se acercó a nosotras y la conocimos, o sea, cambió todo.
Buenos días. Van a hacer sorpresa para los niños. Porque van a hacer sorpresa. Me dicen madre, me dicen Lika por mi nombre, hasta abuelita resulté. Entonces, crear el espacio, coordinarlo y que esto funcione. Este espacio es como la espera y como una preparación, yo digo también, de serenidad y paz para cruzar a Estados Unidos. Su proceso de asilo inicia aquí, en este espacio.
Over the last 4 years, we've had such a huge surge of migrants with nowhere to go, nowhere to be safe, nowhere to be cared for. Medical, food, clothing, shelter, warmth, hot water, that's all here. At this time, we have over 200 people.
Aquí vienen unos maestros que nos dan clases.
Pues yo espero para mi hijo un mejor futuro, que estudie, que sea alguien en la vida y que haga algo en la vida.
He estado apoyando, pues ahorita es Alight. Alight es quien nos ha creído en nosotros y ha hecho posible también un sueño de alegría y felicidad, porque a través de ellos tenemos transformado espacios. Hay un grupo de abogados, abogadas, les dan a conocer cuáles son sus derechos, les dan a conocer todo el proceso de asilo.
Aquí que somos unidos, nos ayudamos mutuamente.
¿Cómo nos ayudan aquí a prepararnos? Manteniéndonos una estabilidad emocional y también física. Hemos estado en muchos albergues y no ha sido ninguno como este.
Sinceramente, acá en Nogales, más tranquilo.
Gente como Ronald que nos están apoyando muchísimo a construir todo esto, porque nosotros solos no pudiéramos hacerlo.
I had a vision to build hornos along the US-Mexico border to bring people together around food, and I was lucky enough to be invited to do that. And so here we are. I'm coming in to maybe simply be a very small catalyst of someone who wants to make an horno, but there are people here who know how to make hornos much better than me, who've cooked on hornos much longer than me. For some, they've never seen an horno. You know, it's a giant pile of mud. The word horno means oven, And everybody has an oven in their house in the United States, and it's just this little metal thing, and they put in some stuff and they close it down. And there's no ceremony or ritual around it. When I say this is an oven made out of earth, it's made out of the ground right beneath our feet. It's made out of the clay and sand, and we just make it into bricks. And it's not a product that you buy, but it's something that you make, something that anyone can do. And it's a technology that's been around for thousands of years.
¿Qué construimos? Sí. Me encanta. Aquí construimos, reconstruimos personas y reconstruimos la humanidad.
Como te digo, soy guatemalteco, ya no soy ningún muchacho jovencito. Acostumbramos a hacer el pan según la costumbre de nuestro pueblo. Tú me dices si se está abriendo, ¿no? Para poner más madera, porque ya estamos muy close.
Sí. The Orino, we just finished closing it up, and now we're giving it one coat of plaster. Orinos are like magic, right? The moment we built it, all of a sudden there's fire, so people gather around the fire. Suddenly there's food being prepared, and so people are gathering around food. Suddenly there's warmth, people are eating, people are talking. So it's amazing how the Orino itself just kind of lit up this space in amazing ways and brought people together around it. My dream is that we can build 100 of these along the border. I think a bigger dream is that how can we share not only food, but these stories across the border. This Orino will be here for hundreds of years, and it's now a member of the community. There was a beautiful sign around here. It said something like, "Fronteras nos divide, pero la tierra nos une." Borders divide us, but the earth unites us.
¿Cuando se van de aquí? Sí. Cada vez que se va una persona, o sea, como llegan, me dan ganas de llorar. Tengo ganas de llorar. Bueno, también llora de alegría. Yo lloro de alegría también. Sí.
Ahora sí ya estamos listos. Ahora yo sí puedo decir que estoy lista con mi familia para poder emprender ese nuevo viaje.
Ha sido difícil, pero pues gracias a Dios poco a poco vamos viendo la luz al final del túnel.
Que estuvieron de los inmigrantes, que nos den una oportunidad.
Muchísimas gracias por tomarse este tiempo para escucharnos.
Cuando esté grande quiero vivir en este albergue, porque está bien bonito.
These projects working in the borderlands come from a real urgency to address the problems that are emerging in the borderlands today. The lack of housing, shelters along Mexico where people are stuck because of the policies of the previous regime, and also the issues of child separation at the border. And so the work that my studio has been doing in the borderlands is not only working hands-on with communities, but also thinking about ways that other forms of art and design can smuggle activism into places where it is not normally expected. For example, a work of graphic design that we've been using as a form of protest called Reunite.
You might be familiar with this well-known traffic sign. It was designed by graphic designer John Hood, a Native American war veteran working for the California Department of Transportation. And he was tasked with creating a sign to warn motorists of immigrants who were stranded alongside the highway and who might attempt to run across the road. Hood related the plight of the immigrant today to that of the Navajo during the Long Walk. And this is really a brilliant piece of design activism. And he was very careful in thinking about using a little girl with pigtails, for example, because he thought that's who motorists might empathize with the most. And he used the silhouette of the civil rights leader, Cesar Chavez, to create the head of the father. I wanted to build upon the brilliance of this sign to call attention to the problem of child separation at the border, and I made one very simple move. I turned the families to face each other. And in the last few weeks, I've had the opportunity to bring that sign back to the highway to tell a story. The story of the relationships that we should be mending, and a reminder that we should be designing a reunited states and not a divided states.
I think our work is often a response to something, and that something is often a problem. Design might be defined as creating a solution to a problem through drawing. While it may not be the solution, it wedges its foot in the door and allows us to see if we can continue that conversation forward. Hidden in the shadows of this drawing, there's the Border Patrol vehicle.
We sketch all of our ideas out together and bounce them off of each other at the beginning of every project.
We began to work at the contemporary US-Mexico border in around the early 2000s. The borderlands have been an evolving context. There was a time when there was no wall. There was a time when the wall was just an idea for national security. There was a time when the wall began to be proposed. And now there's a time when the wall is clearly fixed within our cultural identity. We started collecting stories about what we saw happening, and at some point it became ways to think about how we could conceptually dismantle the wall, dismantle its meaning and identity, to disempower it in some way. And that's where the illustration of the teeter-totter came about. We were illustrating a point about labor balances and imbalances, about equity and inequity, and thinking about the border as a fulcrum, like a literal fulcrum between US-Mexico relations. We were constantly bombarded with news of family separation and detainment at the border.
And we said, we really need to go down there and do this. We're so close, we can just jump in the car and drive down.
The way we present these drawings and models in the form of souvenirs, keychains, snow globes, border wall games, postcards, maps.
Yeah.
You know, one thing we wanted to do is remember the time that a wall was constructed and what a crazy idea that was. But we'd also remember these stories of resilience and activism and ways that people were engaging the wall.
So the wall looks diminutive and small. It's, disempowered. If you look at the early illustrations, they show people lifted up in the air like 18 or 20 feet. People thought, oh goodness, this looks really dangerous, like you're going to launch a person across the border. We ultimately made the teeter-totters maybe 14 feet long instead of 40 feet long, and they lifted someone off the ground 4 feet instead of 18 feet. We painted the teeter-totter hot pink. It is a color that remembers the women who were killed in the femicides in Juarez.
We all got in the back of the truck, and I hate to describe it this way, but it felt like we were going to battle. And our weapons were these pink teeter-totters. And we literally just started running with the teeter-totter. I started running. I don't think the other guys thought we had to run, but I just like, grr, and so they followed in suit, running behind me. And just like, there's just that moment for me when like, gush, like you stabbed the dragon.
And from the United States side, I had the handlebars and the seats, and I put them in so quickly so that we could get at least 5 minutes of playing before the Border Patrol arrived.
I don't think it was more than a second that I locked that thing in place, that there was already a kid with his leg coming over the seat. We ended the event because the children were tired of playing on the teeter-totter like they would at any park. They're ready to move on to the next thing.
It was that 1% that I thought it will succeed, and it did. And it was probably one of the most exciting moments of my life. There's the hope that one day this wall will be dismantled.
And if we design for a post-war world, then what of that remains? I think that's an interesting question to think about, especially when you think about the amount of resources that have immigrated to the border. What do you do with all that steel in a post-war world? How do you stitch together communities, maybe using the remnants of what was brought there to divide that world? I think what we like the most is ideation. We like to think about ideas, and then we try to find homes for the ideas. Because they are ideas, we don't quite know where they stop. We don't know if teeter-totters on the border, if that's the end of the idea. And we probably think that it's not, that there's something beyond that that we will continue to pursue.
It's all a test, it's all a work in progress.
Usar un sub y baja muestra que somos iguales y podemos estar juntos jugando y divirtiéndonos, y también el muro corta estas relaciones que tenemos.
Que venimos aquí al muro, pues sentimos algo muy bonito porque convivir con los de aquel lado y pasear, disfrutar un momento, pues es muy agradable para nosotros.
Me divertí, me sentí feliz porque nunca le habían hecho eso y apenas ahorita lo hicieron.
Since 2007, the U.S. has spent $9.7 billion on border barrier construction, almost entirely at the southwest border. In 2017, the Department of Homeland Security estimated that President Trump's proposed border wall would cost $21.6 billion to build. I've invited my son on these journeys to the borderlands because I think we have to think about the next generation. There's a saying in the borderlands: las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une. Borders divide us, but the land unites us. I'd like to leave you with one simple question. As people whose craft employs the humble material that we find beneath our feet, how can we craft a future using that material so that we are more united and less divided?